If you're a trucker, never work for Dr. Barat.
I've been behind the wheel of a truck for most of my life. I've transported everything, from legitimate goods to drugs to guns. I've been behind the wheel of a truck for most of life and I thought I saw it all. None of the strange cargo I've ever ferried, however, can compare to working for Dr. Barat. I found out about Dr. Barat while having drinks with other truckers. The man was said to be strange and his jobs were even stranger. One of my colleagues spent a couple weeks hauling pallets of medicine from the middle of the forest to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Another would ferry nervous workmen in the company of armed guards from the city center to the middle of the steppe. Dr. Barat was a strange man with strange jobs. But he paid in cash. When my colleagues told me he was looking for a long-haul driver, I didn't hesitate. They warned me, but I shrugged off those warnings. I needed the money. The instructions were simple. I would meet Barat in the industrial district where he would be waiting with the cargo already packed in the truck. The drive would take about 2 days, but it was a straight shot through the steppe. Nothing too difficult. Naturally, I was not made privy to what my cargo would be. The less I knew, the better, or so I thought. The cold winter sun had barely risen by the time I arrived at the meeting point. My colleagues had described Barat as a lean man with messy black hair and a lazy eye. Though there was a truck that matched the specifications of my ride, the scientist was nowhere to be found. Out by the pumps, stood 4 identical giants with shaved heads and earpieces and rifles. Behind the plexiglass of the gas station stood a sole nervous clerk. The armed men ignored the anxious teen. They all stared at me with dumb expressions void of all meaning. "You're here." Dr. Barat walked up behind me, stubbing out his cigarette. He was just as my colleagues had described him, yet he looked a lot more exhausted than I expected him to be. Dark rings around his eyes gave him the look of a raccoon. The disheveled lab coat with coffee stains only amplified the appearance. "You're going to have questions. Don't ask them," he said, ushering me to the truck. "You'll be riding with one of our guards. Don't worry. We're not expecting anyone to interfere. They're mainly here to make sure you won't get any ideas. Which, you hopefully won't." As we walked, he reached for another smoke. He waved the cigarette towards the 4 armed men and whirled it in the air like a conductor. The obedient symphony split. One of the guards climbed into the cabin of the truck. The other climbed into a dark blue chagan parked nearby. "Don't try to talk to the guard," Barat said, as we approached the truck. He put the cigarette in his mouth to light it, but then thought better of the pumps. He's not a big conversationalist. Not a rule. Just a suggestion. Not asking questions is the rule. The trailer on the truck was touched with rust. Its doors seemed to be held together with chewing gum and hope. I had my concerns about the cargo falling out on the road, but Dr. Barat didn't seem like a man who would appreciate interruption. "We'll be driving up front. I have business at the facility we are transferring the cargo to. The guards are just here to ensure the goods get delivered. Hopefully you got your beauty sleep. Tanker's full, won't be stopping to refuel till the evening and you'll be driving through the night. There's go pills in the dash if you need them. Cash. Half here, half there," Barat said, producing a crumpled envelope from his lab coat. "Any questions?" The envelope was heavier than I expected. I shook my head. "Good," he said. Before he got into the driver's seat of the chagan, he lit up his cigarette. Barat was right. The bald giant who was riding with me wasn't much of a conversationalist. As I got in the cab, I wished him a good morning and told him my name. He didn't even look at me. The guard just stared on ahead with an expression that suggested little internal monologue. His vague point of focus didn't change until well into the afternoon. Having a rifle in the cab didn't make me comfortable. The strange bald giant not even giving me the courtesy of eye contact made the situation worse. But I got used to it. Once we got out of the city, I turned on some music. Half an hour in, I had forgotten about the guard altogether. I thought that this is what my colleagues warned me about. Mystery cargo in a bad trailer with a potentially unstable armed man. I had never worked under stranger conditions, but the money was worth it. Back then, as the sun was starting to dip down into night, the money seemed worth it. It was still light when I heard the first sounds. Something was shifting around in the trailer. We were in the midst of crawling through some hills. The shuffling sounds persisted, but I just convinced myself that it was the old trailer settling in from the incline. It wasn't until I heard the first gurgle that I turned off the radio. For about a minute I traveled in complete silence. Then the sound returned. A strained, wet sound loud enough to be heard over the engine. I asked the guard if he heard the noise. As expected, he kept his eyes on the road and his mouth shut. My mind started to race with possibilities about what could be inside of the trailer. I had never transported something alive the size of. The paycheck started to tug at my imagination. The strange groans persisted and their origins grew more numerous. As the creatures in the back of the truck continued to gurgle, I tried to place them within the animal kingdom. Cows, perhaps sheep, could make that sort of sound, but I could imagine no livestock that could make groans so deep and loud. It wasn't until the screaming started, that I realized I was not dealing with an animal at all. It came with such force and suddenness that I nearly drove the truck into the ditch. The gurgles from the back of the truck rose to a shrill, unendurable degree. The screams were tortured and rabid and defied all known biology. The horrid sounds coming from the trailer were loud. Loud enough to catch the attention of the ball giant sitting next to me. Our eyes met. "Do you hear that?" I asked. If the eyes are a window to the soul, the man's mental palace was condemned decades ago. He held my gaze briefly, without expression, and then he grumbled something into his earpiece. He listened. Past the dark screams from the back of the truck, I could hear a voice buzz in his ear. With a nod and another grunt, the ball giant shifted his gaze back to the world beyond the windshield. When I kept looking back at the trailer and trying to make sense of the screeching, he nudged me with the butt of his rifle. The armed man nodded to the road. That's where my attention was meant to be. The sounds coming from the trailer rose and fell as the drive went on, yet they never truly disappeared. My mind jumped from the flimsy doors of the container to the nature of the screaming cargo to the question of my personal safety. I had slept well the night prior, but the screaming from the back of the truck was so intense that I reached for the pills in the dash. I needed to focus. With the amphetamines in my system, time became immaterial. It could have been 15 minutes. It could have been 3 hours. I drove, laser-focused on the Chagan driving in front of me, trying to ignore the horror at my back. I was brought out of my upper-induced trance by another push of the guard's rifle. Off in the darkness of the steppe there shimmered the faint light of a gas station. Judging by the guard's grunts, we were to stop there. I put up no resistance. Barat got out of the Chagan before I managed to climb out of the cab. With his cigarette he motioned to the quartet of giants to attend to the truck. "Let them handle the fuel," he said, walking away from the pumps and putting the cigarette in his mouth. "It's one of the few things they are proficient at." With my legs weak with horror and my voice trembling with shock, I followed the scientist. I broke the one rule Barat had clearly stated. I said no questions. His voice was stern, but once he lit his cigarette, he opened up the pack and offered me one. I don't smoke, but the drugs in my system and terror in my soul made me hungry for nicotine. "The less you know the better," Barat said, looking off into the endless night of the steppe. "The less you know, the happier you'll be. Take it from me. I know much, and I suffer greatly for it." The cigarette didn't soothe my nerves in the slightest. We were standing far enough from the truck for the screams to be muffled, yet even at a distance I could see the trailer rock back and forth with restless movement from the cargo. I demanded to know what I was ferrying across the country. When it became clear to Dr. Barat that I would not continue my work without answers, he let out a long, tired sigh. "I work for a scientific institution," he said, looking out into the ether. "A research facility that has recently come under certain financial strains. Again. The less you know the better, but if this institution were to say, collapse if the things that were worked on in this institution were to get out into the world," he shook his head. The quartet of guards stood by the swaying truck, watching us. "We're past the halfway point. By sunrise, we'll stop somewhere safe to sleep. By late afternoon you'll be a richer man and you'll never have to think about this drive again." Barat spared a look to the truck. He scoffed. "I saw the way you looked at the trailer. I concur. It's flimsy. It's flimsy, but what my superiors want, my superiors get. Don't worry though," he said, when he read the worry on my face. "If any of the cargo gets out, the boys with the guns will take care of it. God knows they're capable of little else." Just as Barat mentioned our armed escort, they all reached for their earpieces. Something was being said to them. They listened. They listened, and then, with discomforting unison, 3 of the men started to walk towards us. The 4th waited by the trailer, watching it rock from side to side with increasing tenacity. The armed men moving towards us bothered me. They also seemed to bother Barat, but before he could say anything his phone rang. "We're past the halfway point," he said into the phone with the slightest hint of deference. The GH-58s have woken up. I hope they'll go back to resting for the rest of the journey, but please let the people at the new facility know that they might what? The cigarette fell from Dr. Barat's lips. What? You can't be serious. All the respect had faded from his voice. Now he was balancing the edge between fury and fear. Asterisk released. Asterisk Henry, this is madness. The Institute has kept its secrecy for decades. What could we possibly gain from? Barat listened intently to the explanation from his phone. I took a step back. The three guards had their rifles raised and they were far too close for comfort. Seeing their attention focused solely on the disheveled man in the lab coat, I slunk off into the darkness. Barat continued to argue with the phone as the trio surrounded him. His panic and disbelief rose into shriller and shriller tones until, finally, he was hung up on. That's when Dr. Barat realized he was surrounded by the guards. That's when he became fully aware of their raised rifles. As he tried to argue with the guards, as he demanded they lower their weapons, I slunk further into the darkness. I knew full well the ball giants weren't conversationalists. I expected them to load him into the car, to maybe rough him up, yet they didn't. As Barat demanded the guards to leave him be, they raised their hands to their earpieces. They were given the order to shoot. The gunshot sent me diving into the ditch by the road. What followed was a long strained silence, only accompanied by the far-off inhuman screams from the trailer. Before the crack of the shots fully settled into the night, a voice came from the gas station. I could not hear what it said. After a couple words it was cut short by another rapport from the rifle. With the looming threat of death and the chemistry floating around my bloodstream, my aim was singular: survival. As silently as I could, I crawled away from the scene of the murder. Through darkness and rocks and cold earth I crawled, until I was sure the men with rifles couldn't see me. It wasn't until I was certain I was hidden by the dark that I raised my head. 3 tall silhouettes stood at the spot where Barat had been executed. In the fluorescence of the gas station stood the fourth giant, staring off into the ether. Not far from him lay the unmoving body of a gas station attendant. I could no longer hear the screams of my cargo, yet the trailer still rocked from side to side. We were in the middle of the sticks. I had nowhere to run. I was certain that if the armed men saw me again, I would end up just as Barat or the gas station attendant did. I kept my head low and watched what the giants would do. After lifting his finger to his earpiece, the armed man by the gas station walked over to the chagan. He took something out of the car and then went to join the trio in the darkness. Beams of light rendered the silhouettes of the giants whole. With little coordination, the three men spread out and started to search the steppe with flashlights. They were nowhere near my hiding spot. That soothed my amped-up heart. What calmed me even further was the realization that the chagan's tail lights were on. The keys were still in the car. Seeing a means of escape, I crept my way towards the gas station. Even though the guard who brought the flashlights was returning back to the pumps, I figured I could distract him and try to escape in the chagan. The guard, however, did not return to his post. Instead, he made his way to the back of the trailer. He reached for the doors, but hesitated. Whatever was in the back of the truck had grown even more restless. The trailer was bouncing from wheel to wheel, shedding rust. The screaming had reached a new dark tenor that murmured through the night. The giant raised his hand to his earpiece once more. He nodded. It was a moonless night. The fluorescence of the gas station shined like spotlights on a dimmed stage. They hid nothing. What crawled and leaped out of that truck defied all reason. Blobs of flesh, at least 4 meters tall, with short stubby limbs. Huge eyes, almost cartoon like in their roundness, took up most of the beast's body mass. The rest was taken up by its horrid screaming mouth. The things swarmed over themselves to escape the truck, stomping on each other's faces, pushing and shoving, and screaming. The faint beams from the trio searching the steppe shifted over to the stampede. The fourth guard had disappeared beneath an avalanche of discolored flesh. The screaming abominations ran off in all the cardinal directions. The things were heavy. As I lay on the ground, I could feel their gallop in the earth. The drumbeat of their stumbling limbs got closer and closer until, to my utter horror, one of the creatures fell into the ditch. It landed flat on its face. It screeched into the cold earth with absolute mania. The lumpy creature was stuck. Feeling like I was balancing on the edge of a heart attack, I wanted nothing more but to crawl as far away as I could from the creature. Yet I quickly realized which way the gas station was. The thought of the guards coming to check on the fallen creature steadied my crawl towards it. I loathed the idea of touching that sickly flesh. Yet the chagan was in one direction and death lay everywhere else. With bated breath and shut eyes, I crawled over the screaming thing. Its warm flesh nearly sent me into a panic, but I pushed on past the fear. My crawl seemed to have dislodged the creature somehow. By the time I was back on the cold earth, the mass of flesh had risen to its stumpy legs. I crawled away from it as quickly as I could. Behind me, the creature ran in the opposite direction. At first it coughed on the raw earth and stone it had swallowed, but it quickly resumed its terrible scream. By the time I had followed the ditch to the gas station, the screams were mere echoes in the plain of night. When I peeked out of my hole, I was further relieved to see the guard had not gotten up. The beams of the searching trio had gone back to searching the night. They were all moving in unison deeper into the steppe. I took my opportunity and crept towards the chagan. The gas station clerk was dead. Undeniably so. A messy patch of dents stretched across his upper chest and his eyes were rolled back in his skull. The adrenaline spared me most of the horror of the sight, but when I saw the guard I could scarcely hold my balance. He was fine. The bald giant was laying on his back looking up at the blinding fluorescence. He was blinking. He was alive and seemed fairly content. When I saw that the keys were, indeed, still inside of the chagan, I considered returning back to Barat's body and retrieving the rest of my payment. The searching trio was far gone into the steppe and the guard on his back didn't seem particularly alert. I considered going back to Barat's body and getting my cash, but then I realized it was the go-pills talking. Thanking all that is holy, I climbed into the chagan and drove off. When I started to back up, the giant that was laying on the floor slowly rose. By the time I was on the main road, he had his hand on the rifle, but he didn't shoot. The gas station quickly became lost in my rearview mirror. Briefly, just as my heart rate started to settle, I saw one of those monstrosities running next to the road. Luckily, my headlights scared it off. Soon enough it disappeared into the darkness, hopefully never to be seen again. I got rid of the chagan in the nearest city and retreated back home. There's little that could connect me to the job, and I pray the armed escort lacks the mental capacity to remember me, let alone describe me. Next time I see my colleagues, those that with such warning put me in touch with Dr. Barat, I'll tell them they were right to warn me. I've driven trucks for most of my life, but no cargo has been as haunting as the one I drove for Dr. Barat.